Hello friends, welcome to lecture number 3. In the last lecture, we covered Dublin principles and implementation of IWRM with 9 important conditions. Next concepts are legislative and organizational framework, types of private sector involvement and forms of private sectors. These are the last two concepts in the third model. So here the first one that is a legislative and organizational framework. So here first we will understand what is the meaning of legislative and organizational framework or legislative framework. Here it says that it is the someone with the power to make laws or rules. For example, United States Congress. So it is called as legislative framework. Someone means it may be a institutions or any head of the institutions with the power. It makes the rules and regulations or laws. This activity is called as legislative framework, and this is the meaning of legislative and organizational framework. And here these are the four important terms are there which is listed here that comes under legislative and organizational framework. First one is policies, legal framework, organizational framework. Then the last one is financing and investment structures. By understanding these four terms, we are able to know this legislative and organizational framework properly. We need to understand these all four terms. So the second concept is that is types of private sector involvement and forms of private sectors. So these are the forms of private sectors listed below here. That is first one is financial, political, expertise, risk sharing. These four are the forms of private sectors. We will discuss in detail when we are in the second concept. Then these are the types of private sectors, that is full divestiture, joint ventures, concessions, boots, that is build, operate, own and transfer. Then the next one is leasing. The last one is contracting out. Here is the Kannada meanings are there. If you are not able to understand or not able to get the meaning of particular word, then you may remember in terms of these meanings also. After covering the second part, we will see some important questions from the model number 3. In the point of view of examination, we will discuss what are the important questions and how they are going to ask the questions which is related to the model number 3. Then we will start the first one, that is a legislative and organizational framework. As I said, the meaning of the legislative and organizational framework, keeping that particular meaning in our mind, we will go through the in detail what about the what is the actual concept of legislative and organizational framework and how it is going to take a part in the water resource management subject. So here a proper enabling environment establishes the rights. This is the main important word what I am telling here. A proper enabling environment establishes the rights and assets of all stakeholders. So the stakeholders means what? It may be individual as well as public and private sector, organizations and companies. And also it may be women as well as men. Whether it may be the poorest or richest person. Whatever it may be, all kind of stakeholders are enable environment establish the rights and assets. Then while ensuring for environmental quality. This is called as legislative and organizational framework role in the water resource management. It is a proper enabling environment establishes the rights and assets while ensuring for for environmental quality. Then the enabling environmental essentially consists of rules of the games that are laid out as to achieve a sustainable balance between the social, economic, and environmental needs for water. These rules can be defined by the four terms that are policies, legal framework, organizational framework, and financing and investment structures. Right? Then we will go through the policies, setting out goals for water use, protection, and conservation. Policy development gives an opportunity for setting national objectives for the management of water resource and water service delivery with concern for overall development of goals. Here, the first condition for the successful implementation of plans and policies is to have an enabling environment. There must be national, provincial, and local policies, legislation, and institutions that make it possible for the desired decision to be taken and implemented. The role of the government is crucial. The reasons for the governmental investment are listed here. So in the policies, whatever the rules and regulations are made, that should be followed properly for betterment of the water resource systems. Water is a resource beyond property rights. It cannot be owned by private person. Water rights can be given to person or companies, but only the rights to use the water and not to own it. So here, for every stakeholders, they must be follow the rules and regulations made by the legislative frameworks that covers the policies and legal framework. In the legal framework, the rules to follow to achieve the policies and goals. Here the required water laws cover ownership of water, permits to use, permits to use it. Whatever the government policies and water legislation, national and international cooperations institutions are made, the policies are there that should be followed very strictly to achieve the policies and goals or to fulfill the basic requirements of the legislative framework in the main view of that is called as legal framework. Then the organizational framework. In the organizational framework, while the governance may be seen in a narrow political and administrative terms as decision making by the government, good government actually requires that all institutional actors involved managing water resource, including citizens, organizations, and private entities, work in a common direction. So in this organizational framework, whatever the government agencies are there, it may be government agencies and private agencies, private institutions should adopt the rules and regulations made by the legislative framework, such as policies and laws. The organizational framework says that all the administratives and some kind of private sectors should adopt these rules and regulations to follow the legislative framework aspects. Then the financing and investment structures. In these financing and investment structures, whatever the private sectors or government agencies made the rules and adopted the system, by through that system we are using the water services For water services, we must pay at least some fund for the betterment and development of the existing systems. That includes the private sectors or some kind of institutions funds, any kinds of persons and stakeholders. They have to pay the amount for the existing systems to develop the present system. It says the financing and investment structures. So the next concept is that is types and forms of private sector involvement. Here types of private sector involvements are there and some forms of private sectors are there. So the exact meaning of types and forms of private sector involvement in the legislative framework, that are in the forms of private sector, we are able to see the financial aspects, political aspects, expertises and risk sharing. Here the financial means again it will come to the financing and investment structures. Whatever the private sectors are there, they need to contribute or they need to collect the some kind of funds, and it says government passes on the cost and work for raising funds to adopt or implement the betterment water existing systems. This covers the forms of private sector in financial aspect. Then the second one is political. Political says that it is a necessary but unpopular forms, unpopular reforms. For example, raising traffics, collecting unpaid bills, reducing the workforces. These are carried out by private companies rather than the politicians. Then the expertise. Private companies are or if large or international, bring essential know-how in some technical and economic fields. Some kind of expertises, it comes under private companies. They suggest the rules and policies for adopting the best one of water systems. That kind of expertise also including the legislative framework part. Then risk sharing. In the risk sharing means it is a kind of leasing or it is a partnership activity. Whatever the whatever the present existing schemes are there, that should be continued by the partnerships. Partnership means the government is going to continue the work with the stakeholders by getting that stakeholders in a partnerships. So it is a kind of risk sharing also. If something goes wrong, then there will be a lot of risk are there. So that it says the risk sharing is one of the aspects of forms of private sectors. Then types of private sectors. The types of private sectors are full divestiture, joint ventures, then concessions, boots, build, operate, own and transfer, and leasing. The last one is contracting out. The private sectors, whatever the listed here, they are taking a major role in the legislative framework which is made in the water supply systems or water resource management system. The full derivative says that transfer of all public assets through sales, in which case the private sector obtain full responsibility of the water supply network, facilitates and operations. It says that it is the kind of full involvement in the policies or systems. Then joint ventures. The joint ventures, partial transfer or partly transfer of assets through share sales resulting in shared ownership and operating responsibilities between the private and public sectors. So as the name highlights that joint ventures, it is a kind of partnership works. Here partial transfer of assets through sharing sales resulting in a shared ownerships are there, and operating responsibilities between the private and public sector takes a major role. Then concessions. A concession says that assets remains in public ownership, but use of the system is to private operates for example 20 to 25 years or 30 years, 10 years, who are expected to invest in a specified improvements and expands in return of fee collection or other forms of payment. First they are going to provide the all kind of assessments, then it is expected to invest in a specified improvements and to expansion in returns of fee collections or other kinds of forms of payments. Then the next one is boot, build, operate, own and transfer. This scheme where contractors for the construction of particular infrastructure projects are required and where ownership is handled to a public organization after a specified number of years. This kind of activity comes by the own risks. That means they need to build it, they need to operate it, and they need to survive it for the designed period, and then finally they may transfer the schemes also. So in this boot it says that whatever the schemes are there, it is developed and owned, then it is later transferred. That comes in the types of private sectors. Then the leasing. Leasing means it is the water system remains in public ownership, but it is leased to private operators. Whatever the government has executed or implemented the scheme, it may be leased for the private sectors also, and it is run for certain period. But it is depends upon the agreements between private sector as well as the government. Then contracting out. As we already know that what is the meaning of contracting. The least it is the form of private sector involvement. A water undertaking subcontractor certain functions to private firms, example meter reading or collecting the funds. Even when water service are provided by the private sector, the government still has a key role in providing a clear regulatory frameworks and ensuring that the poor and secured and users are protected from excessive cost. So this kind of activity comes in under contracting out. It is a rules made by the one authority and it is handovering the private sectors, or it may be including private sector as well as government also. Here the government is also having a certain power to rule the policies, but it is a contracting out means it is for the certain time only. It is not a lifespan or it is not a permanent. So this says about the private sector involvement in the water resource management systems. So finally, what we discussed in this model, we gone through the definition of water resource management. Then we came to know what is the integrated water resource management. That is definition of IWRM, then principles of IWRM, implementation of IWRM, legislative and organizational framework, meaning of legislative and organizational framework, then types and forms of private sectors, that involvement in the IWRM. So we have covered these all concepts and gone through the in detail whatever the small concepts are there in between legislative and organizational framework, as well as the different types and forms of private sector involvement in the water resource schemes. Then we will discuss the some important questions. Here are the some important expected questions are there in the point of examination. The first question is, explain briefly the necessity of IWRM. So here it is asked for 5 marks. Don't bother about the marks. So here you need to explain the purpose of the IWRM, necessity of the IWRM, why it is required, what is the meaning of this integrated, and how it is going to change this water resource management system or make a stronger the water resource management existing systems. Then definition of IWRM is for 2 marks only. Then explain the Dublin principles. You need to explain that 4 Dublin principles with the example. Then the fourth one is explain some important conditions for implementing IWRM. That 9 conditions are there. 9 conditions are there. You need to explain the 9 conditions properly, how the implementation of IWRM takes place with the help of these 9 conditions. Then fifth one is write a note on legislative framework. So here you need to write the meaning of legislative framework and organizational framework as I explained in this lecture. Then you need to explain the policies and legal framework, financing and structures, so on. You need to explain that legislative framework. Then write a note on institutional framework. This is question number 6. Write a note on institutional framework. Here, if you consider any private sector, in that private sector, how they are going to work together and what are the assets are there in the institutional framework, how they are going to implement that policies as well as rules and regulations according to the institutions. That is institutional. Then the next question is what do you mean of private sector involvement? What are the private sector involvements and how they take the a major role in the water resource systems? You need to explain the private sector involvements. Then explain briefly necessity of private sector involvement. So here it is a brief explanation of necessity of private sector involvement, why it is required, why the private sectors are required. Then the last question is explain types of private sector involvements. So types of private sector involvements: full divestiture, joint ventures, then concession, boot, leasing, contracting. You need to explain these all terms. So here forms of private sectors: financial, political, expertise and risk sharing. So these 9 important questions are listed here. You need to practice it and consider it as the assignment work for the model number 3. Thank you one and all.